Welcome back to Slick Talk. I'm Blackstone Joe. Today I'm joined by Matt, a.k.a. Garage Engineer. Matt, thanks for joining me.
Hey, no problem. Glad to be on the show.
So, what's the story behind Garage Engineer? And for those who don't know, that is your Instagram handle. So, can you tell me about the beginning of that account?
Sure, no problem. The name Garage Engineering comes from the fact that I'm an engineer by day. I'm an engineer in the mechanic in the automotive industry, so that's where the name came from. The account itself kind of got started. I think it was 5 years ago. I started. It was more of a motivation tactic for me to get my butt in gear working on my car. My Camaro that I have now at the time, it's a third generation Camaro, and it was in a million pieces in my garage, and I was kind of losing a bit of motivation. So I started posting videos or just posting some pictures of the car and kind of setting goals for myself to hold myself accountable. And it kind of took off from there. So I kind of getting some people jumping in saying they like the project, or I would ask questions on a problem I was hitting and people would respond. After that, people started seeing me at autocrosses or at events that I would go to, and they would actually come up to me like, "Hey Matt, like I saw your video, thanks for posting." And I was at that time I thought, just my wife and my mom were watching my videos and that was it. But it turns out a lot more people have been watching them than I had thought. So as that kind of progressed, people were asking me about, what parts do you have on your car, and asking for advice on doing your first track day or your first autocross event or something. So now it's kind of been, kind of the direction I go with my account is I really just like to encourage people to get out in the garage and work on their cars and not be afraid to take on some big projects and one step at a time. Just encourage people to get out there and drive and work on their cars. So it's been a pretty cool journey so far, but I've been really liking it.
So, it sounds like this isn't necessarily your day job, or at least it didn't start out that way. So, is this totally just when you find the time, or has it kind of evolved into more of your daily focus, as for all the activities that are captured by this account?
No, it's totally on the side. So like I said, I have a full-time job. I have a family at home and some other commitments. So this is basically whenever I have the time, and that's it's actually what I've been try to encourage in my account too. Is that a lot of people as you get later in life and you have a family and you got a lot of commitments. Sometimes your car project really takes a cut, or just you have to sell your car or something like that. So for me, the time that I spend on my car is later at night. I go out in the garage from like 8:30 to 10 at night or something like that when the kids are in bed or things are a little quiet. So I always encourage people on my account to, if it's really is a priority to you and you want to get your car done, you got to make time for it, and make that a non-negotiable for yourself. So that's how I treat this account. Is it's definitely not a full-time thing. I wish maybe someday it'll get there, but for now it's just on the side, and just squeezing in a half hour here or half hour there, and chipping away at it.
What's the overlap between your 9 to 5 and what you do in the garage? How big is it?
In terms of like technical stuff or just time.
Yeah, does one feed into the other at all? As far as like, does your knowledge in the garage feed into what you do in your 9 to 5? Like, or does one influence the other in any sort of way?
I would say the biggest part of the overlap is, so I'll give a bit more detail on my 9 to 5. So I help to engineer some parts that go on cars. So we work very closely with all the big OEMs in the industry. So the biggest part that I take away from my 9 to 5 that I bring to the garage is how much work goes into engineering parts and testing parts that go on cars. So let's say, let's say the new Corvette, for example, right? So the first thing people do on a brand new Corvette, if they buy it, if they're going to track it, is upgrade the brakes or upgrade the suspension or all that stuff. But coming from my background and what I know, I know the sort of testing that GM does on those braking systems and that suspension to make it durable and last 100,000 miles and survive in the Arctic Circle or survive down in the Sahara Desert, that encourages me to use a lot of OEM parts on my car. So, for example, my brakes in my Camaro, instead of going to Willwood or instead of going to a big aftermarket manufacturer, I use brakes from a newer Corvette because I know that the parts have been tested to hell and back. And they also, I can go to AutoZone and buy brake pads. I can buy a replacement caliper. So all that stuff was biggest, I would say, transition from what I do on a daily basis, bringing that into my own garage. And it's sometimes the parts are cheaper too, which also helps quite a bit.
And so, if you had to, I'm interested in going a bit further back than just the garage engineer account. If you had to say, let's write a book about your experience, with automotive, the automotive world, period. What's the first chapter for you, even predating, the account and what you do now?
Sure. Yeah. If you want to go way back, I my parents were always telling me stories when I was growing up that I was just for some reason obsessed with cars and trucks and vehicles. Like every book I read was about cars and truck. I'd sit in the window and watch the street and, watch the snowplows go by or watch the trucks and point out all the different cars. So it really started early. And then as I grew up going through school and stuff, I have old notebooks from high school. All I'm doing is just doodling cars on the side of my notebook pages and all that stuff. And then from there, that really led me to going to college and getting a mechanical engineering degree. That's really what drove me to, a lot of people sometimes struggle with what they want to do in college. But for me, I was lucky. It was like crystal clear. That's what I want to do. I want to work in the automotive industry. A couple of big events, I guess, that stick out to me that really solidified my love for cars and automotive stuff was I remember 2005. I was playing sports after school, and that was the year the C6 Corvette came out. So that was a really big break from the C5 to the C6 with the non-pop-up headlights and everything. It was like a really crazy looking car at the time. And my neighbor had bought one of the first ones, went to pick it up at the factory, and my mom saw him come home in the driveway and sent him to come pick me up from practice after school. And I just remember that coming around the corner, and I was like, "Oh, that's the new Corvette." And then it was my neighbor, and I was like totally over the moon that I got to go home for a ride in like a brand new Corvette at the time. That was really something that solidified my love for cars. So then fast forward through college, I go through my mechanical engineering degree. I would say the next big automotive milestone for me was my dad surprised me one weekend where he had found it was a 75 Corvette that was kind of rotting away in somebody's front yard. And he had gone and just, made the person an offer and kind of took it off their hands and brought it home for us to work on as a father-son project. So that was really cool. Neither of us had really had much mechanical experience. Even though I love cars so much, I didn't really have a chance to do much more than just wash and wax cars and stuff like that. So we kind of took it on as a little father-son project. And then, on the weekends, we, do small stuff like we redid the interior, got the engine running right, tuned up the carburetor, all those little things. So that eventually led to me trying my first autocross with this 75 Corvette. So if you know 75 Corvettes, not the highest horsepower year Corvettes. It had big 15-inch, tires on it. So not really the best for autocross, but I had a blast. And I kind of got hooked on autocrossing. And what I did was, being an engineer that I kind of sat down and made a spreadsheet and was thinking about, okay, so if I want to make this 75 Corvette competitive in an autocross or even be able to take it on a road course or something like that, what's it going to take? So I made my whole list of parts. Even with a budget in mind, it was like way more than I had to spend at the time, being late into college and just graduated college. So what I decided to do was I actually sold the car. And, that was a tough decision for me because it was kind of a, father-son project. So I had a lot of emotional attachment to it. But I sold the car and I bought a C5 Corvette. That's what we had talked about earlier. So the C5 Corvette, I thought at that time was a really good value. You could pick them up for relatively cheap and they could do anything right out of the box. So they can go be competitive in autocross, go be competitive on the road course. So I bought that car and I got more experience in autocrossing and road racing. But after a little while, I ended up actually getting a little bored with it. So the car, like I said, was fast as hell. You could drive it on the highway for 6 hours with the air conditioning on and get 30 miles per gallon in sixth gear. And then what I found in the off season, when I live up here in the Boston area, so it's cold in the winters, we have a long off season. There really wasn't much work the car needed. So I'd wash it, change the oil, do that stuff, but there really wasn't much mechanical stuff that it needed. And also when I went to a track event, I was probably one of 10 other Corvettes there. So I ultimately then decided to sell that car because I wanted something a little bit more unique and, something that I wanted to work on a bit more on and making my own. So that's what leads me up to the Camaro. So after doing some bit of research, I decided the third generation Camaro was kind of in the sweet spot of, being an engineer. I made a little, there was some sort of chart involved, I'm sure, with cost of the car versus how many aftermarket components are there and, how big of tires can I fit. So third gen kind of popped up as at the top of the list of like a great value of a car I could afford and still have a bit of money left over from selling the Corvette to do a few upgrades. So that brings us to about where we are today with the Camaro.
Yeah, and the Camaros where our interaction started. So you sent in a sample from the 87 Camaro with the 5.7 V8. What was your interest when you first sent in the sample? What were you looking to learn and how do you come across Blackstone in general?
Sure. So I think to answer the second part of your question first, so I don't remember exactly when I first heard of Blackstone. I just feel like it's always been in the back of my mind. So I'm always, watching car shows on TV or YouTube channels and things like that. And Blackstone just always something I've known about, is something I've always wanted to try. So with my Camaro, the motor in the car it's not original, and I really don't know much of the history on it. So I've had it out of the car, but I basically just resealed it and made sure it was nice and clean. I repainted it and just put it back in the car, really without doing too much detective work on it. So as I got it running, the first time after I had the engine out, I was just really curious about kind of what the insides of the engine were and how it was going, but I was also noticing I was burning a bit of coolant. So it wasn't enough where I was really suspicious at the time, but we'll get into the results in a second. But it ended up being probably something I should have paid attention to. But I noticed I was just constantly topping off the expansion tank just a little bit. And in my mind, as I went throughout the summer of driving it, I just thought, well, maybe it's just a system burping itself. It's just kind of broken, or maybe there's a little leak dripping that I'm not noticing. But turns out I probably should have been paying a little bit closer attention to that.
Yeah. So when we got you the results, I remember taking a look at the report after you sent it over to me, and we saw a lot of sodium, which jumped out on our end, especially because you were running Mobile One, if I remember right.
Yeah, that's right.
And Mobile One doesn't use it as additive. So that was a big giveaway. And we also found some excess metal, which, from my mind, you're doing autocross, you're bound to have, some more wear than average just by virtue of use. But with sodium in there, it did point to a leak. But I'm wondering, was that the first coolant leak that you had tackled, or was it something that you kind of been familiar with tracking down issues like that, not necessarily in this engine, but maybe others?
Yeah, this is I've had definitely coolant leaks before. So I've had this car since 2017. So I've had it for about four, almost coming up on 5 years now. There's been many, many leaks I've chased down over the years. Typically coolant leaks, the ones that I've seen in the past where maybe an intake bolt was going into a coolant patch and I didn't have enough sealant or RTV on it or something, but that would leak externally so I could see it and kind of fix it and really know that I solved the problem. With this coolant leak, though, this is one of the ones where it was probably the hardest to find and took me the most digging to get to.
So, what was the exact issue allowing that coolant contamination to reach the engine oil?
Yeah, so it ended up being a head gasket issue. So when I got the results, I was like, okay, I kind of had this in the back of my mind as I'm hoping this is not what I'm going to see, but I'm glad that we're actually going through this. So I started with just taking the intake manifold off, and I looked really closely at the gaskets, and I was trying to see if there was an obvious leak path. I was actually hoping to see something obvious, like either a torn gasket or a place where the RTV was torn or something like that. But everything checked out okay. The gaskets looked great. There was no scarring on either the surface of the heads of the intake. So I kept digging a little bit deeper. So what I did next was, before I pulled the heads off, I did a pressure decay test on the cylinder. So I got a rental kit from one of the local auto parts stores. And what that kit is, if anyone doesn't know, you can pressurize the cylinders with some air and just do a leak down test on it. So you can see, make sure it's still holding pressure, which should be a clue if your head gasket is blown or something like that, or something's wrong with the engine. That ended up checking out okay. So I kept tearing down the motor, more. And finally, when I popped the heads off, I was able to see pretty clearly that one of the cylinders looked a lot different than the rest of them. So I think the coolant leak that was going into the cylinders probably wasn't enough to catch on that pressure decay test I was talking about. And that also is kind of why I explained, when I took the oil sample, the oil was still black. So I hadn't really seen any evidence of a coolant leak. So there was no steaming from the engine. There was no milkiness in the oil, things that you would typically see from a big coolant leak. So kind of looking back as I was taking apart the engine, all these little clues of, fairly slowly topping off the expansion tank, passing the pressure decay test that I did before I popped the heads off. It all kind of makes sense that it was a very slow coolant leak that I really wouldn't have found until I actually physically looked at the cylinder and saw some of the corrosion that was happening because of the coolant that was in there.
Well, not to toot our own horn, but it does make us pretty excited that we are able to help you before you get to that point, because I think so often, and you're very capable, obviously, but so often, I'll let people know, hey, we're seeing the signs of this, and they'll be like, well, I'm not seeing enough on my end, because it is quite a bit for people to tear into an engine like that.
No, that's yeah, not to cut you off, but this winter I was specifically telling myself I do not want to get into a big project this winter. I tend to have a bad habit of tearing the car apart way too much over the winter, and I don't get it back together till like May or June, and I miss half the driving season up here in Boston. But this one was definitely warranted.
Well, exactly. And what where are you at now with it, as far as, not just the leak and the repairs, but are you ready for the next season, or is there anything else you're looking to do to the car before you get it back out on the road?
Well, this is I'm sure a lot of car people listening will relate, but it's kind of the I'm in a big while you're in there type situation right now. So I have the engine half torn down, the heads are sitting on my workbench. What my plan is the heads are actually already got them back in the machine shop. So while they were off, took them over and had make sure they were flat, because that could be cause of a gasket leak. So I made sure I had them build very little to make sure they were flat. Had the valve job done, had them all refreshed, new seals and all that stuff. So that was kind of a no brainer while the heads were out of the car. And going back to me not knowing much about the engine, I'm very much on the fence about doing a cam swap while I'm in there. What's kind of holding me back though is that with the current supply chain issues, the cams are 2 or 3 months out right now, which puts me at the time of this recording, late April or something like that, which I think is a bit too late for me. I know the cam that's in the car is aftermarket. It definitely is a low P idle, seems to pull okay. So I think what I'm going to do in interest of time is I'm going to stop where I am right now and start the rebuilding process. So I have all the gaskets in, I have the heads all reconditioned. So I think for now, chipping away at, like I said, after 8 o'clock every night or whenever I can find time, start putting the motor back together so I can, I really want to make sure I have a full driving season this year. That's what's important to me. And I think if I start now, I should be able to get it together when the snow stops falling up here.
So, if not the 87 Camaro, what else are you taking care of? What else might you end up taking a sample from just to help with the maintenance plan?
Yeah, good question. I just actually recently purchased a secondhand truck that I use to tow my car to some of the further events. My car, usually 2 hours about my cutoff point. So if a track is 2 hours away, I'll drive my car there and drive it home. Anything above that, I try to tow it just in case something happens and I can't make it home. So my truck is it's a 2008 GMC Sierra Denali that has the 6.2 liter V8. I just bought it recently. It has 90,000 miles on it, so relatively low miles for the year. But I'm coming up on my first oil change, and it's definitely going to be something that I'm going to send in for a sample because towing is not easy on an engine, and I want to make sure that everything's going okay before I go through. I have 3 or 4 trips coming up this summer, I hope, where I will be towing the car, so I want to make sure everything's going okay on that motor before I abuse it anymore over the summer.
Is there anything after the first analysis? It's a lot to take in, all the elements, what they mean, the physical tests. Is there anything that kind of surprised you that we can help inform you about as far as the used oil goes? Is there anything you thought, oh, well, I didn't know that was going to come up? Or kind of what are you looking for now when you are going to go through your next analysis? Elements that you'll be paying attention to, anything like that?
Yeah, the big thing for me that I thought was really helpful from the report was not only just the presence of the coolant, but also the fact that you called out of how much damage that was doing in such a short amount of time. And that's really what kind of sparked me to, I can't let this go any further. This isn't something I can just band-aid and kind of limp along through another race season. Like, as you mentioned, autocrossing and road racing is really tough on a motor. And if there's anything in the oil like sodium, which is really abrasive, the oil is doing the opposite of what it's supposed to be doing. It's not lubricating and it's actually destroying the engine. So I have my report here. I'm looking at it too. I mean, the fact that in the comments they called out like copper was 3 times what it should be. So was tin. So was aluminum. It's pretty obvious that even that tiny bit of coolant that wasn't even causing milkiness in the oil was really doing a lot of damage to the motor. So my plan is to, when they get the motor back together, maybe do a 500-mile interval or something and send in another sample just to make sure that it really was the coolant that was causing all that damage. So I think if we can, if in the next report or two, we can see, okay, the coolant levels are down in the oil or there should be none in the oil and your wear levels are back up to or back down to where they should be. That's my game plan. I really hope that we caught this in time and then I can save the engine for many more happy race seasons.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it makes sense to include oil analysis with what you do, given, your motto in your Instagram bio, build it right, drive it hard, keep it clean. But other than oil analysis, is there anything that you kind of pride yourself on maintenance wise plays into that motto, how you take care of your vehicles? Is there anything that you think, from an individual standpoint that you do that sets apart, your maintenance or how you're able to keep your vehicles performing the way you want them?
Yeah, I think there's a few things that go into that. I think first one is going back to part selection and making sure that the parts you select for your car are quality parts. I think that goes a long way in making sure your car is reliable and it's running. And even if that means, I'm definitely on a budget myself for my car, but to me, budget doesn't necessarily mean buying the cheapest parts. It means buying the best value parts. So there are instances in a car where buying the most expensive part really will save your budget in the long run because you're not constantly tearing the car apart to get back at it or change it, or it's failing at the wrong time. But yeah, maintenance wise, I try to change the fluids as much as I possibly can. It's probably my big maintenance thing, especially with autocrossing and road racing. Things like brake fluid is something really important to pay attention to. I do my transmission and my rear gear oil every year at least, and I try to keep pretty accurate records too. So this Blackstone, all these reports are definitely going to go in my file folder to keep track of everything. And I think the next thing I definitely want to do next is test the transmission oil and the rear diff oil. I've been really interested to see what's going on in there because, again, those were on the car when I bought the car. I've simply just changed the fluid that I don't really know the mileage on them. So I think doing analysis on those two when I get the change in the fluid, hopefully the next month or two is definitely going to be on the list.
So everyone seems to have a very different approach to, especially like transmission fluid, like how
Yep.
often they want to change it. A lot of people we come across, they'll claim that they don't want to ever change it because there are some theories out there. I'll just call them that. One of them being that like it will mate to the transmission. And if you dump the fluid, then all of a sudden you'll disrupt this wonderful relationship that, of course, isn't taking into account all of the metal buildup, all of the solid buildup that occurs. But what's your typical process when you go with transmission fluid? Are you looking for a certain amount of mileage? Do you believe in changing it? What's your game plan? Because that really tends to be different for so many people.
Yeah, so I guess I'm definitely not a chemist by any means. So this is just kind of just going on feel. But for me, if the fact that I use my car so hard, so I do probably 5 to 6 autocross events a year, probably 3 to 4 track day events, which gets it's a manual, it's a T56 manual in my car. The fluid's getting really hot, and I'm really beating the hell out of it. So for me, my maintenance schedule is being at least once a year I change the fluid. And again, going back to using quality products, I do use some quality synthetic oil in the transmission. But I guess I don't have any data to really back up if keeping it in there for the life of the transmission or changing every year really helps or not. But for me, I just feel like fresh fluid every year really can't hurt, I guess, especially if you're using the same fluid over and over again. If there is any mating going on or any sort of interactions going on with the metal and the fluid, to me, if you're just taking out the dirty fluid that's suspending all of the particles or any of the bad stuff and you're replacing it with fresh stuff, it's all the same chemistry going on in the transmission, and it should be happy. Hasn't let me down yet, so that's kind of been my strategy is once a year because I beat on it so hard. If it was just a street car, I think I would do something a little bit different. Now going to my truck, which is an automatic and is doing a lot of towing, that one I think I'm going to follow a very similar process where, again, towing is a lot tougher on a car. You got a lot of weight behind it. You got a lot of stress in the transmission, especially downshifting, upshifting. So that one I think I'm going to follow a similar regimen of maybe doing it once a year, maybe once every couple of years. But I think with the analysis that Blackstone would do, that might tell me a bit if I'm changing it too early or not. So I'm interested to see what those results are.
Yeah, absolutely. And when it comes to like automatic versus, if you're looking at like a gear lube, it really just comes down to what that fluid can handle. Like, for example, an ATF really can't handle a lot of solids, very few, if any. The oil passages are just so intricate. When you get into like a splash lubrication system, it can handle quite a bit more because it's not nearly as complicated of a system. And especially, I would say probably the biggest red flag to look out for that we come across would be with like CVT transmissions, as far as making sure that it has to be absolutely the right spec fluid. Otherwise, failures are just imminent. ATF, gear lube, using analysis to find out if you're changing it too often, it's definitely worthwhile. And especially when you're getting into like a street car, you can really stretch it out, quite a bit longer. So yeah, there's really a different process for everyone. I was interested to hear yours. Obviously, I'm looking forward to seeing trends build for that Camaro once you get it back out on the road. Do you have any events that you have your eye on?
Yeah, I do. I have a few events this year. One of the big ones that I'm most excited about is called the Summit Autocross Week. So this is an event that's going to be brand new this year, and it's up in the Northeast area. It starts at UMI Motorsports Park in Pennsylvania, and it's very similar to Hot Rod Drag Week. If some of the listeners have heard about that, but basically it's a week-long event where every morning you're autocrossing all morning and you're recording your fast time, and then you're packing up your stuff and driving to another track, and you have to be there by the next morning. So it's a really cool event, I think, because it tests really the whole aspect of your car. So if you really claim that your car is a, quote unquote pro touring car, which is the style of hot rodding where you can do everything, you can drive on the street, you can do the road course, you can do autocross. It's a really cool event where, put your money where your mouth is, and let's see if your car can actually do that. If your car is comfortable enough to drive and actually can put down some fast time. So I'm really hoping the car is going to do okay. I'm not an expert driver, and my car is, kind of middle of the road, kind of a budget build. But I'm really looking forward to having some fun on that event, and I think I'm going to bring my dad along with me too. So it should be a pretty fun week to go see what the car can do.
So you've been doing this a little while. Would you say though that you're like, would you come off as like someone who everyone knows you at this point? Or are you still kind of a fresh face when you go to these events? Or what would you say your status is like as far as when you roll up with that Camaro? Do people know who's coming?
I would say I'm kind of, middle of the road. I would say there's I race again in the Northeast. There's not a ton of events around me, so I have to go pretty far to get to some events. But that UMI Motorsports Park I had talked about, I probably go to 2 or 3 events there every year, and it's really really up and coming in the Northeast. Is a really premier autocross complex. It's awesome to go to some events there if nobody's ever been. But when I go to those events, yeah, there's a lot of the same people every year. A lot of them I interact with throughout the year on Instagram and checking in on how their builds are going, and they're commenting on giving me motivation to finish mine. So I would say it's people do come up and say hi. Maybe every event there'll be 2 or 3 people that come up that are new that'll say, "Hey Matt, I saw your Instagram account. Thanks for posting this," or they're asking me some questions on my car. But I would say I'm definitely not celebrity status, and that's okay with me too.
Yeah, well, with the rate that Instagram account's growing, I wouldn't be surprised if that changes for you. But the last thing I wanted to get into, because I was doing a deep dive on your Instagram before we sat down today, and I learned we did have something else in common, and that is that we both talked ourselves into running marathons.
That's true.
You have done more than me though, and also more challenging. So I just did a virtual one where I picked a course around my hometown during 2020. You've done the Boston Marathon. Is that 3 times now?
Yeah, I've done 3 Boston marathons and a couple of others. But what I'll say is that the Boston Marathon, after running that, every other one just seems so boring, I would say. So if you're a runner out there, absolutely put the Boston Marathon on your list. It's such a I went to university in Boston, so I grew up kind of watching the race, and it's such a cool day in Boston where the whole city shuts down. Everybody goes out on the marathon course and cheers it on. It's like a big party throughout the day, and it's really really when I was in university, I was so inspired seeing people finish a marathon. I was like, I will never do that. But I guess just a bit of a quick backstory. So what really got me into running it was in 2013 there was the bombing at the Boston Marathon, which was really really devastating for the city of Boston. And I was actually living in Ohio at the time, so that kind of sparked me to, hey, I've always said I wanted to do this. What a better time to go do it next year and show that the city of Boston is going to be intimidated by stuff like that and get back to run it. So packed up all my stuff, moved back to Boston, found a charity to run for, and ran it the next year. And that's where I met my wife too, was training for that marathon. So it's kind of funny how everything happens for a reason. But yeah, awesome race. And if you haven't done it yet, I would highly suggest putting it on your bucket list.
Tough thing about that one is the qualifying time. Boy, I mean, what was your qualifying time, by the way, when you ran
So
your first one?
yeah, I was actually able to get in a different way. So the way you can run the Boston Marathon is, yes, you can qualify for where you have to be really fast to qualify for the Boston Marathon, which is super impressive for people that can do that. I actually got in through a charity. So every year there's a certain amount of charity bibs that are given, and a lot of the charities around the Boston area, they were given a certain amount of bibs for the race, and you can apply for those bibs with the intention of raising a certain amount of money. So every year I would go and I ran for what's called the Joe Andrewsy Foundation, which raises money for cancer patients. And every year I pledged to raise at least $7,500. So it's quite a bit of a commitment. So you're training for a marathon, which is almost a full-time job in itself, especially over the winter in Boston. But then you're also trying to fundraise. But it's an awesome experience. You run events like I used to host like a trivia night or a charity hockey game or something like that. And when you cross that finish line, it's all worth it and all the hours you put in. It's a really cool experience. But yes, that's another way you can get in is hooking up with a charity and doing it for a good cause.
So are you still racking up miles on foot, or is it mostly behind the wheel right now?
I would say mostly behind the wheel. My running days are a bit behind me. I'll go for some quick runs to try to stay in shape, but for the most part, the long distance stuff is behind me. I'm not saying I'll never run one again. I'm sure the itch will maybe come up later in life, but for right now, I'm just back on getting some car miles in.
Yeah, it's always tempting. I have my eye on a couple, maybe Chicago. I think that might be the next one up. We'll see. But yeah, I think that's cool. We have that in common. And I'm looking forward to, tracking more of the data, from your Camaro, seeing what goes on, following what else goes on your Instagram, especially. Everyone, as a reminder, that Instagram handle is garage_engineer. Give Matt a follow. The content is quality. And by the way, you do all of that yourself, right? I mean, whether it's photos or, when any work you do, it's all you, right?
Yeah, it's all just me. I have just my iPhone that I take my pictures with, and I come up with whatever captions or value. I try to focus on making posts that are intended to help somebody. I don't like just posting a picture and saying, "Here's my car." I hope that people are getting a little bit of value out of it. It seems like they are. And yeah, if anybody needs any motivation to get going with their project, I'm always trying to engage and answer as many questions as I can. So please feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to help.
Well, that's cool. I know I'm going to stay tuned. That wraps us up for the day. So, Matt, thank you so much for joining me. I look forward to linking up again soon.
Thanks, Joe. Appreciate it.